Okay, APUSH Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. Welcome to another video. This is chapter 23, the first half, the ordeal of Reconstruction, and these are the years of Reconstruction. I would highlight this and know these years, 1865 to 1877, and this chapter is going to finish up with period 5 in APUSH. We want to thank the Eagles with the song Desperado, and hopefully you can see how it'll fit for the song about freedom. The African Americans, the slaves, were now freedmen, but the freedom they had was not very good. All right, this quote from Lincoln, I love his quotes. I love Lincoln. And after the Civil War was going to be done, he said that we were going to have malice toward none with charity for all. This was his inaugural address after winning the 1864 election. He said this about 1 month before his assassination. Basically, he's saying that we're going to treat the South without hatred, and we're going to be forgiving for them and bring them back into the Union. Unfortunately for the country, Lincoln is not around during the problems of Reconstruction, and we had some serious problems. And here are some of the key topics, and maybe the biggest one is going to be the one down here. The 14th Amendment is maybe one of the most important amendments in the Constitution. Okay, the first section of reading is the problems of peace. So the war is over in early April 1865, but there are still many questions that had to be answered, and Reconstruction was not going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't, and it was a serious problem for the United States. So here's some of the key questions. How are we going to rebuild the South? Because they were devastated after the war economically. What are we going to do for them? What about the freed blacks in the South? Okay, how are they going to live their lives? How are we going to bring the southern states back into the Union? That was a problem that had to be answered. And what are we going to do with the Confederate leaders? Jefferson Davis, for example. Again, they were traitors against the United States. Were we going to execute them? Are we going to show some forgiveness for them? Then who's going to be in charge of Reconstruction? Will it be the president, or will it be the Congress led by the radical Republicans? So these are some of the key questions that were going to be answered. And the bottom line is, we know that the southern way of life was ruined, physically and psychologically damaged. Thankfully, slavery was over, yet many Southerners, despite the end of the Civil War, were still defiant about being back in the Union. So the first question is, what are we going to do with the freedmen? And so I would just be aware of this term. The freedmen were the former slaves, so they're called freedmen. So what was their freedom going to be like? So many slave owners actually tried to re-enslave their slaves after the Union troops left in the South after the end of the war. But eventually, the slaves were going to become free because of the 13th Amendment. Some slaves actually did stay loyal to their masters despite being free. I would definitely highlight this. This is very important. Most of the blacks in the South, the freedmen, they became sharecroppers, okay, and that's an important thing. And basically, they became farmers on the same land that they were slaves, okay. So most of the freedmen did not leave where they lived before as slaves. So sharecropping was a system of agriculture where the freedmen would stay on the land where they used to live, and they would work the land for the white owners, and then they would reap some of the crops, some of the profits of the crop when harvest came. And so that was a way for them to kind of slowly pay off their debts for living on the land. And so the problem with that is it was a very poor way of living for the freedmen, and they could never really get out of the debt to their white landowners. Besides sharecropping, some other slaves did destroy their master's land and property after the Civil War, so they were very unhappy with them. And thousands of blacks, unfortunately, were homeless after the Civil War in the South. So it was a very sad time, even though they did have their freedom. So the two things that did help grow the Southern blacks' confidence, to help them grow stronger during and after Reconstruction, included education. That was an option for some of the blacks, partly because of the federal government came down with the Freedmen's Bureau, and the church also became very important for the freedmen to focus on their black community to help it grow stronger. Another term that I think you should know that's not on this page is the term exodusters. And the exodusters refer to the freedmen. Many of them were located in the Deep South. They left the Deep South for the West, and they headed to Kansas in a mass exodus. 25,000 freedmen in the 1870s left for Kansas in the West, and they called them the exodusters as a reference to Moses leaving Egypt. Okay, a must-know in APUSH is the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, and the Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1865, and the greatest gain of the Freedmen's Bureau was it was designed to train and educate the freed blacks in the South. It also did help some of the poor whites in the South. So this was a government organization created by the federal government that went down into the seceding states after the Civil War to try to educate and train many of the freedmen, and it taught 200,000 blacks how to read because education is very important. And it was kind of a primitive welfare agency. The federal government tried to help these people to overcome being free and getting used to freedom in the South. So there was much controversy with the Freedmen's Bureau because the federal government was so big and it was expensive. So the Freedmen's Bureau was not renewed after 1872. So it was around for 7 years to help the freedmen get educated. But when the Bureau leaves in 1872, the federal government does not help the freedmen. So we're going to talk about President Andrew Johnson, who was the Tailor president, because that's what he used to be before going into politics, as he was a tailor. And so he becomes president after Lincoln's death in April of 1865. So his background, he was a poor and humble background. He was from Tennessee. He was a mountain white, and he did stay loyal to the Union. And he is known as the champion of the poor whites versus the planter. So he definitely did try to support the poor, especially poor whites in the South, against the aristocracy of the planters. And he is the only Confederate congressman not to leave Congress when the South secedes. Okay, and so he stuck with the Union despite being from Tennessee. So his background, they call him the Tennessean, who never earned the trust of the North because he was from the South, and he never regained confidence of the people in the South because he didn't join the Confederacy. And you can argue that he was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and we needed to have a strong president to see the country through Reconstruction, and unfortunately Andrew Johnson was not that president. The next section is presidential Reconstruction. So we need to talk about Lincoln's vision of Reconstruction before he was assassinated. So he believed that the South never legally left the Union, and so he had a relatively simple restoration plan to bring the South back into the Union. So he said that for the southern states to come back into the Union, 10% of the southern voters had to pledge an oath to the Union, and they had to free all their slaves, which he said with the Emancipation Proclamation, and it became final with the 13th Amendment. And so he said if the southern states did this, they would be readmitted into the Union, and this is called Lincoln's 10% plan. So I would highlight this: 10% of the southern voters had to pledge an oath to the Union and to end slavery, and then the states could come back into the Union. And Lincoln's plan was very forgiving. Okay, and again, it goes back to the quote on the first slide, with malice toward none, charity for all. So Lincoln was going to be forgiving to get the South back into the Union. Unfortunately, Lincoln's not around to oversee Reconstruction because of his assassination, so now it becomes Andrew Johnson's got to decide what he wants to do with Reconstruction. And a very important point I would highlight this is that the radical Republicans in Congress, okay, these were the ones that were most for ending slavery and helping the freedmen. They wanted to punish the South. They wanted to punish the white Southerner. So the radical Republicans, again, who were, even though Lincoln was a Republican, many of them were against Lincoln. The radicals felt the 10% plan was too lenient towards the white South, and so they decided to pass the Wade-Davis bill. This is important. I would highlight this. And this bill required that 50% of the voters had to pledge allegiance to the Union, but this bill was never passed because Lincoln vetoed it before he died, and the 10% plan remained temporarily in place. Very important that you must know during this Reconstruction time period are the two types of Republicans. Okay, the moderates share Lincoln's views, and so they're a little bit more forgiving towards the white Southerners, and then there's the radicals, okay, and they wanted to punish the South for the war. So the question is, which one had the right view? And that is up for interpretation. Now, as much as I love Lincoln, he was a moderate on this, and so if you were a moderate Republican, you maybe were not as supportive of trying to help the freedmen completely, okay, whereas the radicals, which sounds like a negative term, but the radical Republicans really wanted to help the freedmen, the blacks in the South, gain more equality, and so they wanted to punish the white Southerners for the slavery that they created for many years. Hey, I got another slide for presidential Reconstruction. Is that important? All right, so after Lincoln's assassination, the 10% plan, Lincoln's 10% plan was in question. So Andrew Johnson takes over, and the radicals, by the way, a must know, these two groups cannot stand each other. The radical Republicans were not the biggest fan of Lincoln, but they could not stand Andrew Johnson at all. And so, I wonder why. No, Andrew Johnson gets impeached. I wonder why. Maybe the radicals had something to do with it, probably. So anyway, when Johnson takes over, the radicals thought that Johnson would do what they wanted and would punish the white Southerners. But that does not happen. Andrew Johnson actually tries to follow Lincoln's 10% plan, and so he agrees with Lincoln on that the South had never legally been outside the Union. Andrew Johnson supported the 10% plan, and he said all the Southern states had to do was to ratify the 13th Amendment, and he ends up granting many pardons to many of the Confederate leaders. So Andrew Johnson, a must-know, is very lenient toward the white Southerners during the Reconstruction time period, and this angers the radical Republicans. All right, the Baleful Black Codes. Okay, a must-know and a push. In order to control the freed blacks, many Southern states passed black codes. So these are the Southern states that left the Union, joined the South. So when the Civil War is over, these states, have to find a way to control the freedmen, and so they passed black codes. These are not good. These laws were aimed to keep the blacks in check, socially, economically, politically. So it tried to allow the white Southerner to keep their dominance over the blacks. And so here are some examples of some black codes that I would be aware of. So these were some laws passed in some Southern states. So blacks who walked off their jobs were subject to penalties or fines. Okay, so if you left your job, if you're a black, you could get penalized or you could get fined for it. Blacks were forbidden to serve on juries, and an African American could be punished for idleness, for just staying around, not doing anything. They could be punished for that. And there were other more severe black codes than that. And so these black codes tried to keep the freedmen in check and not really give them many freedoms. And so some, especially radical Republicans in the North, like, well, these black codes are awful. I mean, are the slaves better off after the Civil War? Well, of course, they're not slaves anymore, but the Southern states passed these laws to limit their freedom. I think an important point to make is the timing of these black codes. These black codes were passed after the Civil War, 1865, 1866. They were around for a year or two in the South after the Civil War during Reconstruction. These are different from Jim Crow laws, and perhaps you remember what Jim Crow laws are. Basically, they're laws of segregation. These black codes are different than Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws will come around in the South in the 1880s into the 1890s when segregation really starts to happen. Okay, now we're going to talk about Congressional Reconstruction. So what did Congress actually decide about the Reconstruction question? So by December 1865, many of the Southern states came to be reintegrated into the Union. And many of these Southern states said, we want to join the Union now. We're going to follow the 10% plan and end slavery. And many of these states had former Confederate leaders and Democrats that wanted to join the Congress. And so the radical Republicans in Washington, D.C. were disgusted to see their former enemies on hand to reclaim the seats in Congress. So this is in the end of 1865. These Southern Confederate leaders come up to Washington to reclaim their seats in Congress. And the radical Republicans are like, nope, you guys cannot join Congress. So as the book said, the radical Republicans banged the door shut in the face of the newly elected Southern delegation. Okay, another reason why the Republicans were so unhappy with the Southerners coming up is because they were able to do many things without the Democrats and the Southerners in Congress. So the Republicans passed a bunch of laws. The Morrill Tariff, which raised tariffs. Pacific Railroad Act, which allowed for the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. And also the Homestead Act, which allowed people to move out west for cheap land. And so the Republicans did not want these Democrats and Southerners in Congress because they'll have less power. So many Northerners worried that the South would become politically stronger than before the war with them reclaiming their seats because now the freedmen counted as a full person. And so the Republicans were like, no, this is not acceptable. Even though on December 6, 1865, President Andrew Johnson declared the South had satisfied all the conditions to rejoin the Union. So Andrew Johnson was willing to let the South come back into the Union, and it does not happen in 1865 because the Republicans, very important point, the Republicans in Congress says, nope, they need to do more things in order to join the Union, and we'll get to that later. All right, so hopefully you're seeing some conflict starting to develop between the Republicans and Andrew Johnson in Congress. And so Andrew Johnson repeatedly vetoed Republican passed bills like the Freedmen's Bureau, but the Republicans were able to override his veto and allow it to continue to 1872. Johnson also vetoed a major civil rights bill in 1866 to give more freedoms to the freedmen in the South. And so as Republicans start to gain more control of Congress, like I mentioned, they're able to override most of Johnson's. Most of Johnson's vetoes with a 2/3 vote. Highlight this, the 14th Amendment. Okay, it's one of the most important amendments in America and also in APUSH. It was created in 1866, and it sought the same ideals as the Civil Rights Bill that was passed in 1866. And this is very important. The 14th Amendment was going to give citizenship for African Americans. So for African Americans, they're going to have the rights of a citizen in the United States, all the rights that come with that, except for the right to vote. Radical Republicans were disappointed that blacks weren't given the right to vote. That would come with the 15th Amendment by 1869. But the 14th Amendment is the critical one during the Reconstruction period, giving the freedmen and African Americans in America citizenship. Okay, the final section is swinging around the circle with Johnson. So in 1866, this is an election year, not a presidential election year, but an election year in Congress. And so the Republicans would not allow Reconstruction to be carried on without the 14th Amendment. So highlight this. So the southern states, if they wanted to come back into the Union, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to African Americans. So President Johnson is unhappy. He's clashing with these Republicans. So he wanted to lower the amount of Republicans in Congress. So he wanted to get more Democrats in Congress. So he goes around the country. Okay, Andrew Johnson does, trying to drum up support for the Democrats and to criticize and to belittle the Republicans in the election in 1866 for Congress. So this is where Johnson gives his round-the-circle speeches. So he's going around the country, letting people hear his message, saying that we need to get rid of the Republicans, and these are a series of give 'em hell speeches, fiery speeches to denounce the radical Republicans, but they don't work. His speeches do not work, and Johnson's backfire. And I think partly because people didn't really like Johnson very much, but even more Republicans were elected to office, partially maybe because Lincoln was assassinated a year before that, and he also was a Republican, so they had support there. And so the question is, what happens next to Johnson with all this Republican power? Well, in a year or two, Andrew Johnson will become the first American president to ever be impeached. And as much as I don't like Andrew Johnson, he probably should not have been impeached, and we'll learn about that later in chapter 23.